So thanks very much for joining me. My name is Lawrence Newcombe. I work as an architect for an organisation called NCS Trust. I'm going to be giving giving an overview of a few suggested patterns to use to control Apex sharing, managed sharing, using a couple of patterns around how to do this with click and configure capabilities, and a couple of patterns on doing this using code features. So there's a couple of links to my Trailblazer and GitHub at the bottom there, and I'm also just happy to say I'm just fresh out the mint. I just heard this week, amongst all the other news this week, a very small slice of positive news that I passed the technical architect board. So I'm now CTA. So firstly, just a little bit about NCS, the organisation I work for. So we work we work to provide a program, the NCS program, to around 100,000 young people a year. So the NCS program is designed around social action and experiences for young people. We use a Salesforce instance to manage the program that's delivered by a network of partners. We're actually the largest non-profit Salesforce customer in Europe. We do some very cool things with the platform, and we are also actually recruiting at the moment for a developer. So if you're interested, look me up and do let me know. I'm also, in my spare time, I do a little bit more Salesforce as well. I'm the developer of an app called Formula Share. It's completely free app, open source, also available on the App Exchange, and it's intended to really sort of lower the bar to some of the more implementing some of the more complex sharing scenarios on Salesforce. So scenarios that you would otherwise normally need to resort to Apex sharing. Can be addressed through this free app, and within the app, I've actually implemented a couple of the patterns that I'll be introducing today. So firstly, just a little bit about kind of what managed sharing is and how it works in Salesforce. So you've probably seen a few different terms for what is essentially the same thing. So Apex managed sharing, Apex sharing, programmatic sharing, they all mean the same thing. Essentially, it's interacting directly with what's called the share table. So each object in Salesforce that is shareable, which is to say that any object which isn't either public read write or a child object of master detail relationship, it has a corresponding share table that's maintained by Salesforce and contains various records that control the sharing of that object. So the easiest way to kind of visualize what's inside the share table is the sharing button that is sadly for now only available in Classic. But if you click that button, you can see essentially a representation of what's in the share table for the object. So here in this example, there's a couple of share records that relate, in fact, in this case, to Apex sharing, and one that is a representation of the ownership of the record. So there's a couple of different kinds of sharing that are involved in that table. So Apex sharing, Apex managed sharing basically means creating and deleting the records that are in that table. So a bit more of a kind of a look inside what's going on in these records. So inside a share record, there are four for a custom object. There are four kind of important fields that we need to consider if we're working with Apex managed sharing. So firstly, the parent ID field. So this is a lookup to the record being shared. The user or group ID. This is the record ID of the entity which needs to receive the sharing. So that's either a user ID, public group ID, If our sharing is for roles or roles and subordinates, there are corresponding records for those in the group table, which can be referenced from a share record. There's also an access level field, so this needs to be set either to for Apex sharing, either to read or edit. There's also an entry that can be used for full access, and that's not something that can be provided through Apex managed sharing. And then lastly, for custom objects, we've got this really helpful capability, row cores. So row cores can be populated with the API name of an Apex sharing reason. So Apex sharing reasons can be set up against any custom object, any shareable custom object, and essentially it's a way to set up a category of sharing. So we can have a number of Apex sharing reasons against an object that allow us to group and categorize the types of sharing that are provided within the share table. So these can be used both for manual sharing and also for Apex managed sharing. Currently, you can only set these up in Classic, so there's nothing stopping you using these in an org which is Lightning only, but you do need to switch to Classic to be able to set them up through the UI. So a few things to think about if you're looking to implement an approach for Apex managed sharing. So firstly, thinking about for sure we're going to want to create share records as part of our logic, but we need to consider, do we also need to revoke those in some circumstances? So are there contextual changes on records or related records that mean that that a shared record now needs to no longer be shared with the entities that it previously was? And so most of the time the answer to that, I would say, is yes. And it does make the implementation quite a bit more complex to make sure that we're doing that in an effective and secure way. Secondly, around we have sort of additional considerations that we need to apply depending on whether we're working with standard or custom objects. And the biggest difference really between working with these two is that the row cores or Apex sharing reason that I mentioned is only available for custom objects. So what that means is any sharing in the share table for standard objects, essentially we can't distinguish between sharing which has been applied for one reason or another, and in fact we also can't distinguish between that sharing and actual sort of manual sharing that might have been applied through Salesforce Classic. So particularly when it comes to revoking and checking that share records have been created through a certain circumstance, it's much easier to do that with custom objects than it is with standard objects. We also need to think about so how often do we need to assess sharing, or how quickly do we need to apply sharing at the point that a record is first set up, or there are changes in the org that mean sharing needs to change. So depending on some of the business requirements that we have around when sharing needs to apply, that could also influence the approach that we need to take. And also thinking about exceptions. So there are certain validations that happen within the share table that Salesforce will apply. So and we'll throw an exception if we're trying to create share records which don't meet the expectations that Salesforce have. So for example, if we try to create a share record for a user who is inactive, Salesforce will throw an exception. So we need to either to kind of design around all of the potential reasons that Salesforce would reject that attempt to create sharing, or we need to design the implementation in a way that exceptions won't cause our transaction overall to fail. So just a few thoughts on why it's important to do this stuff right. So I'm sure we've probably most of us have been in the position of this guy on the left of a user comes with an error message of insufficient privileges. So what this means basically is that they've tried to open or edit a record that they don't have that level of access to. So it could be for a good reason. It could be because we actually haven't shared those records effectively. And then I hope none of us find ourselves in the situation on the right. I don't need to emphasise how important it is to not share to people who are who really shouldn't have access to that data. So over the next few slides, I'm just going to give kind of a brief summary of the overall patterns that that I'd suggest to use when we know that we have a requirement for managed sharing. So there's four kind of main patterns, some main sort of flavors of circumstances that we would look to implement managed sharing, and some different approaches for each of those. So two of the actually, firstly, just to mention, so I'm not going to go into really great depth on any of these, but there are reference implementations on GitHub of all four of these. So do check out that repo. All the code, all the configuration is there. You can spin up a scratch or deploy, see the processes and flows working. So two of the patterns are code-based patterns, so utilize Apex capabilities. Two of them are configuration patterns, so using process build and flow. And for each of those technology types, we've got one pattern that is intended for applying or revoking sharing in real time, so based on immediate updates in the org, and two that are excuse me, two that are based around scheduled recalculation. So the first pattern, real-time sharing with code. So essentially this uses logic that's called from a trigger handler to set up the sharing and to revoke the sharing if necessary. That's often a good one to apply in an asynchronous context, a queuable method or a queuable class or a future method or potentially an asynchronous trigger. Real-time sharing with clicks. So here we'd use a process over the object which needs to be shared, and invoke flow to actually go through the process of checking existing sharing, creating shares and deleting shares if required. Third pattern, scheduled sharing with code. So here we've got a scheduled batch which iterates over all of the records of the objects which needs to have sharing applied. Assesses whether or not sharing is needed or needs to be removed, and manages the creation and deletion of that sharing. And then the fourth pattern there is scheduled sharing with clicks. So this does a similar thing, but with a scheduled flow. So this would be a flow that runs perhaps once a day and iterates over all the objects which are shared, and again creates and deletes sharing as necessary. So I'm just going to run through a few kind of mini scenarios of illustrating kind of where and why we might want to use these patterns. And so all of these scenarios kind of refer to a sort of hypothetical recruitment application. And this first scenario is sort of fairly straightforward. So we've got a job application record. We've got an interviewer user who's specified through a lookup on the record, and we want to share the applications with the user who's specified as the interviewer. So in this scenario, we need to think about, okay, well, what are the circumstances that we might need to set up that sharing or to change that sharing? So in this scenario, it's pretty straightforward. So we basically, new application, we probably need to think about applying sharing. And when that application is updated, that sharing might need to change. So in this scenario, one of the real-time patterns is pretty ideal. It's fairly straightforward in terms of the cases we need to cater to. So that's a pretty good pattern for this scenario. These scheduled sharing patterns, you can use them in this context, but it's probably a bit overkill, and we do obviously lose the benefits of real-time calculation. So the next example is very slightly more complicated. So we've got the application record needs to be shared to a hiring manager who's specified on a linked job object. So here again, we've got to consider the scenarios that an application is created or updated. Also in this instance, if we really want to be thorough about this, we'd also need to think about, okay, so what if an application is undeleted? Potentially the job hiring manager might have changed in the meantime. So we should really consider that might need to lead to a change in the sharing. In this example, we also now need to think about what happens on the job record. So what if the job's updated, hiring manager changes? What if the job's deleted? Then maybe we need to stop sharing with that hiring manager. And if we have stopped sharing, then but we then undelete the job, perhaps we need to put that sharing back on. So to cater to all of these scenarios in real time, it's possible, but there's quite a lot of kind of logic branches in there. There's a lot that we need to consider. So it kind of becomes questionable as to whether it warrants the complexity of implementation to try to catch all of these scenarios in real time. So in this example, this is where it's probably worth starting to look at one of the schedule patterns. And finally, kind of a slightly more complicated example again. So perhaps now the determination of sharing on the application is related not just to the application and the job, but also the country record. So you can see kind of how this, again, this is still relatively speaking quite a straightforward scenario, but we've already got potentially 9 different sort of situations where we need to consider the implications to sharing. So in this example, trying to catch all of this with real-time patterns is kind of becoming quite impractical, really. So scheduled sharing is probably the right approach in this example. It's worth mentioning, these aren't mutually exclusive. We could potentially have a scheduled pattern that caters to all of the potential scenarios. So that scheduled pattern obviously just needs to consider the sharing that's already on the application and the new sharing that might be needed. And then potentially we could also have a real-time pattern running across maybe just the application object and just catering to new applications and changed applications. So for the majority of cases, it feels to the user like the sharing happens in real time, but we also have a scheduled pattern to allow the application to catch up with any other changes that might have happened that affect sharing for the application. So just to summarise some of the circumstances we need to that might sort of influence which patterns write. So the real-time sharing with code. So yes, as we saw, sort of it's ideal really when there's just a single logic on a single object involved in the sharing, and obviously being a code-based approach, it's depending on what you've already got in your org, that might or might not be the right thing to start introducing trigger logic. So if we've already got a trigger and it's just a single object, that's probably the right way to go. The real-time sharing with clicks, again, usually best when there's just a single object involved. The scheduled sharing with code pattern. So this is normally good to look to when there's related objects which are involved in the sharing, and particularly when those relationships become quite complex. So sort of grandparent and higher sort of relationships to the object needing to be shared. And the scheduled sharing with clicks, again, ideal where there's sort of multiple objects involved. And specifically, we need to be kind of conscious around this pattern that under the the limitations that we have with scheduled flow. It's 250,000 records currently per day that can be processed. So given that we're going to be iterating over large numbers of records with these scheduled flows, if we are in a situation where our shared objects, there's large numbers of those, that's probably not the right approach if there's any risk that we're going to be getting close to that limit. Okay, so I was just going to now just spend just a few minutes just briefly showing a couple of these patterns in action. So I'm just going to jump over to my London's Calling org. So we've got an application that represents how London's Calling may be organised. So just two objects, sessions and tracks. So within sessions, we've got two types of sharing essentially that apply to sessions. So if I so you can see we've got a look up to the speaker for a session and a look up to the track. So what we've got implemented in terms of sharing is we've got a real-time sharing with code pattern to share to the speaker of the session, and we've got a scheduled sharing with clicks pattern to share to actually to the track lead user of the track that is linked to the session. So if I click sharing here, so this is it's quite a nice component. It's actually a Salesforce Labs component, so it's available for free. It kind of mimics the effect of the sharing button in Salesforce Classic, and it means you can see all of the shares that have been set up against this object. So you can see here this is sharing to me as the speaker, and it's sharing to Todd, who I've allocated as the track lead for the track record. So I'll just run through firstly that first pattern, the real-time sharing with code, and I'm going to be going pretty quickly, but I'll just focus on some of the key elements that we use as part of this. I do encourage you, if you do want to know more, just jump on my GitHub and have a browse around. So we're using here an asynchronous trigger on the session object, so that operates on the session change event. So session is just set up for change event tracking. So as part of this trigger, we iterate over the change events. We're looking out for change types which are updates or creates, so changes to the record or new sessions. We build a map of all of the record IDs that have been created or changed, and the speakers that need to be provided with access. If we do have speakers that need to be set up, we run a query on all of the existing share records that we have to the records in scope, and then for each of these share records, we basically check. Okay, so for the record that we're looking at, essentially, is this the record that already represents the sharing that needs to be applied? So is the user or group ID the same? Is the access level the same? And as part of this query, we've also checked that the row cause is the same. And if that's the case, so we can take that out of our map, which becomes our sort of set of records that we need to create sharing for. Otherwise, we can get rid of the sharing, because we know that now must be old sharing that's no longer required. So then we've now got our set of records we know we need to set up sharing for, and so we iterate through those, and then if we do have a speaker that needs to be provided with access, we set up a new session share record. We set the parent ID, the user or group ID, the access level, and the row calls, as we saw in the summary of these records, and then set that up as a record to be created. And then finally, we've got our list of everything, all the shares to be removed, all the shares to be created. We go ahead and delete all of the sharing to be deleted, and then we insert all the sharing that needs to be created. So we're doing this as part of as a try catch, and with database.insert with all or nothing false. So that kind of helps protect against some of the exceptions that Salesforce may have around. So trying to share in ways that aren't supported, or ways that aren't valid. So if we were in a situation where we had an inactive user on a session record, this would prevent that session share being created, but it wouldn't stop the transaction from continuing. So that's the real-time sharing. Just to jump back, so you can see the track lead sharing is also applied. So I'm just going to show. So this is scheduled sharing, so it's not it's not easy to see in action. It will run once a day, but this is the flow essentially that applies that sharing. So we've got within the start element of the flow, so this is set up to be a scheduled flow to run every day, and we specify the session object as the object which needs to be shared. And in this example, I'm saying just run this for every single session record. So reassess sharing for every record. We could potentially reduce down the scope to keep within that Salesforce limit if we're working with a particularly big application. So just in terms of sort of how this flow sort of works at a high level. So firstly, we have a query. So based on this flow will run one record at a time essentially. So as a scheduled flow. So the first thing it does is goes and gets the track record, which will have the track lead user based on the record ID of the session. It will then go and query for the session share records, so the existing sharing that's already in place for that session, and then it will loop over all of those session shares. It'll check basically, is this already the share that we want? So it'll be comparing the values within that share record to the values that we need to apply for the sharing as per the business logic. If that sharing is already the same, we say, yeah, okay, we've already got the sharing that we need, so we set a flag to remember that. Otherwise, we just go and remove that sharing, so we know we know that sharing is no longer valid. And then once we've gone through all of the share records for that object and for that sharing reason, we check, okay, did we find one that was the correct sharing already? In which case we don't need to continue. Otherwise, if we do need to create a new share, we use an assignment element to set up the share record, and then we go and go ahead and just create that share record. So although these share records are kind of they're in some sense not objects that you can go and customize, but they are available in they're available in Process Builder and Flow to operate on, just like other objects and custom objects. Okay, so it would be great to be able to take questions in person, but unfortunately I'm coming to you non-live. But if you would like to ask me any questions, please do feel free. If you'd like to just post questions through the app, I'll do my best to get back today on those. You can also just do feel free to reach out to me through GitHub or through Trailblazer community, and just do let me know if there are any questions related to the presentation, but also more generally related to the patterns. Very happy to help out. And finally, just to say thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.